Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Morze, and today I'm going to be talking about fraud. Now, I usually tell people a long title of what I do is How to Detect and Deter White Collar Crime. And I've got to stress that if you add together every single robbery in the United States, every bank robbery, every liquor store, that only represents about 2% of the actual financial fraud of this country. All the rest of it is white collar. And what's amazing is it usually can take 10 or 12 guys to commit a big crime, whereas a white collar crime can frequently be done in the billions of dollars with just one person doing it. Behind every single fraud you can imagine, there's always going to be at least one guy, sometimes more than one, who is like what we would call the puppet master. He's behind the scenes. He is making whatever the story is, he's making that a reality. And in doing so, he's playing to people that are what I call the triumvirate. That's three things. It's lawyers, bankers, and accountants. And if you can't get those three people on your side, believing what it is that you're doing, believing what it is you're telling, if you can't get them on your side, it's not going to happen, no matter how great the story is. Now, today I'm going to be talking about multiple frauds. The first one I'm going to talk about is the fraud that I was the puppeteer for. It's called the Z-Best Carpet Company. Now, Z-Best was really four Z's. It's Z Best. And we used to do commercials where we would say, we're Z-Best. And the commercials actually won a Clio Award. It's one of the best commercials on television, and people really loved it. Now, at Z-Best, we did two things. We cleaned carpets, something you might presume when you hear the title of the company, the Z-Best Carpet Cleaning Company. But we also did a thing called insurance restorations. Now, what's an insurance restoration? Well, we would claim that buildings had water or fire damage, or sometimes from a natural disaster like a hurricane, and we'd come in and fix it. We didn't do any construction, we did reconstruction. And it's important that I set that aside because you have to realize what we tried to claim and were successful at doing was that we did something very unique. Now, you're going to hear that word a lot in my talk, the word unique. Because one of the things that almost every fraudster tries to do is to show that what they're doing is different from anybody else's. And it's that very uniqueness that will make you believe them when maybe common sense would tell you that can't possibly be true. Now, in addition to talking about the Z-Best fraud, I'm also going to be talking about things like Enron, things like Bernie Madoff, things like Theranos, the company that claimed to be able to do 260 diagnostic tests on a single drop of blood. I'll also be talking about one of the largest banks in the entire world, HSBC. All of these companies that I just mentioned have all had the same problem, and that is that somewhere in their organization, either at the very top, in the middle, or off in the periphery, somebody was doing something illegal. And it's that very illegality that eventually was found. Now, invariably, when these things happen, when someone finds what the fraud is, they end up saying, but this was so straightforward. I mean, this was jumping at us. How come people didn't get it? How could you possibly believe the cover story? And the way you end up having the cover story believed is through tedious paperwork and story after story after story to convince people that there's a reality there. In order for a fraud to happen, there has to be a great deal of reality. Almost no one can just go out and say, I'm going to commit a white collar fraud. They almost always have something that's very real. And usually what ends up happening is they stumble on something totally by accident. They go, my gosh, I just realized that whenever the auditors come in and look at things, they never audit this one account. So I can use that as a slush fund. Or they notice, hey, nobody ever bothered to look behind the mirror to see if this is true. Or no one ever checked up with the customer to find out if they were really satisfied. And once you find that element that previously hadn't existed, the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. But until you find that, everyone believes it. And that will be a recurring theme as I talk to you today about the very things that a fraud has to have and did have and does have and how they were found, but look at the damage that was done to all of the people. Now, right now, I want to tell you that Let's start off for 1 second looking at the case from the early 2000s, the Enron case. Almost everybody's heard of it, even though it was 20 years ago. But it's very important to realize that Enron did $450 billion of actual real trades. There was a huge reality. There was a big building. There was the tilted E of the word Enron that everybody knew. It was this huge company and it was setting the world on fire. People couldn't stop talking about Enron and all the miracles they were doing and all the trades that they were doing. So that reality was there, but they caught themselves up into something what I call the shark mentality. A lot of people don't know this, but sharks don't sleep. They just keep moving their whole life. Well, some frauds take on a shark-like aspect. They have to continue to grow or the whole thing falls apart. Now, what made Enron so important is that it had to make its numbers. That means that somewhere an expert said, we expect Enron to do X. And if Enron doesn't do X, then their stock gets hit. And remember, stock can do three things. It can go up, it can go down, and it can stay the same. And two of those things are bad. Staying the same is bad and going down is bad. And the only way you make it go up is you always produce more than anyone expected. But the experts sometimes can make it sound like you've got to really, really, really do something outstanding to even come close to making your numbers. And if you listen to the news today, you'll see sometimes they'll go, well, the stock report came out today and on higher earnings, interest rates did X, Y, or Z. But the simple truth is those projections are things that had to be made. And in the case of Enron, they always had to exceed what the expectation was. And there was never enough business for that to happen. Now, a lot of people have said to me, you know, Mark, you committed your fraud back a couple decades ago, and things have really changed with the computer today. And they're absolutely right. The computer has made finding fraud a whole lot easier. I know that because I've worked at the FBI Academy teaching FBI agents about fraud. So the computer has been a huge boon to finding fraud, but it's been 10 times bigger in committing fraud. And usually if I talk to a group of 100 people, 90 of them will raise their hand when I'll say to them, has anybody ever tried to steal your identity or put something on your credit charge that you didn't really do? And invariably the hands go up and I go, that's all because the mobsters, the fraudsters, the lawbreakers are actually more adept and better at getting what they want out of that computer. In my day, I had to make documents. I made over 30,000 documents. I did that to convince Wall Street that we were doing hundreds of millions of dollars of these insurance restorations, when in reality, we were doing none. Now, how is that possible? I created the paperwork, and it's paperwork that people exist on. I once gave a talk to a group called Archer Daniels Midland, and they cut down a lot of trees. They create a lot of lumber. And one day I was talking, and I asked during a break, I asked the CEO if I could see some inventory. And he brought out a bunch of paper that had ink on it, and he said, here, Mark, this is our inventory. I said, how many trees do you cut down a year? And he said something like, oh, it's 2 million. But he goes, but we plant 3 trees for every one we cut down. I said, okay, well, I'm not here to complain about how many trees you cut down or plant. But I said, you must be the worst company in the world because you cut down millions of trees and all you created out of it is 12 pieces of paper. And then he looked at me and said, okay, Mark, I get what you're saying. If you look on those pieces of paper, there are numbers, and those numbers are what our inventory is. But I said to him, but notice I asked you to see your inventory. I didn't ask to see numbers. Now that kind of exemplifies exactly what I'm talking about. It's numbers and how they relate to each other, how they tie together, that makes a fraud even possible. Now at ZBest, we had over 1,200 employees in the largest boiler room in the country making phone calls to get people to clean their carpets. We had trucks driving all over the western United States. We were doing thousands and thousands of dollars worth of carpet cleaning. And that gave us the reality. People could see that. They could see our commercials on TV. They heard about us. They heard about the way that we did our business. And we kind of turned carpet cleaning from what used to be one of the worst businesses in the world, guilty of bait and switch. We turned it into a real moneymaker one that NASDAQ fell in love with. And we did a public offering that sold out in record time, all because people believed in it. They believed in the story. And that entire division, with all of those employees, was responsible for about 8% of our income and 0% of our profit. The insurance restorations, we claimed we were doing over $400 million worth of restorations, where we would go in and fix a building. And that division was responsible for 100% of our profits, which was in the millions of dollars. And yet that division had only one employee in the entire division. It was me. Once we made up the jobs, the CEO and myself, we made up a job, we would claim that I went out and bid the job, I got the job, I filled out the invoices, I hired all the subcontractors, and oversaw all of the business. And I would claim that I was flying all over the country looking at job sites, when in reality, I was just right there in Los Angeles almost all the time. You think about it now and you think to yourself, how could anyone believe that one single person could run that entire division? And yet, we were able to convince them because we were able to convince people that we were totally unique. And I'm going to use that word unique quite a bit during the course of today. But what I want to get to right from the get-go is I want people, you out there listening to me, to indemnify yourself. I want you to protect yourself. Now, what is Mark talking about? Well, let's go back to that example of Enron. In the Enron case, 114 people were called people of interest or person of interest. That means that the Department of Justice is investigating you, and they're looking to find out if you were part of the fraud that now everybody knows about. 114 people had to sit at their home and think, oh my God, I look like I might have done something wrong, but I didn't. Now, 31 of those people did get indicted and either went to jail or pled guilty or did whatever was required of it. But that means that 83 people had to sit there for 5 years until that statute of limitations ran out, all 5 years waiting to hear that knock on the door. I can't imagine how frightening it would have to be to sit there and think at any moment I might get indicted and my whole life would turn around. Hey, and being investigated by the Department of Justice is not a really good resume entry. So you've got to protect yourself. And the best way to do that is to follow some of the easy steps that I'm going to go through in today's talk. And what I want to stress is that words really matter to me. I'm going to do a little bit of bragging right now, but I was one of the only scholarship football players at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, to ever get a perfect score on an SAT test. And I had to memorize hundreds and hundreds of words, and most of those words we never ever use. Sometimes I even try to show off, and I'll take a date into a loud place and I'll say, oh, this place is a veritable cacophony of sound. And they'll go, what? I go, it's loud. And they go, well, then just say loud. Don't use those big words. But words really matter to me. And there's two words that almost every person in this audience misuses. And you probably do them almost on a daily basis. And those two words are the words simple and easy. We use them as if they mean the exact same thing. And frequently they do mean the same thing. But in reality, they can have nothing to do with each other. Now, if somebody said to me, Mark, how would you handle world hunger? And I say to you, that's simple. Feed people. It's only two variables, food and people, feed them. And then someone would say to me, oh yeah, Mark, that's simple. That's not very easy to do. And I go, exactly, but it's very simple. Conversely, something can be very easy, but not be simple. Like my 8-year-old nephew can build a whole castle out of Lego toys. But he's 8 years old. It was easy to do, but it wasn't simple. There was 1,000 different pieces that all had to go together. Those two words get misused, but they're pretty harmless. There's other words that get misused that aren't quite so harmless. I, for example, have heard people misuse the words evade and avoid. Now think about that. I've seen news reports where they'll say, so-and-so did X, Y, and Z to evade taxes. And then we find out that what he did was perfectly legal, and he didn't do it to evade taxes because you go to jail for that. No, he did it to avoid taxes. And while evasion of taxes is illegal, avoidance is mandatory. I bet you never thought of that. In fact, if you pay someone to do your tax return, by law, they have to take every available deduction to make sure you pay the exact amount of tax that you actually owe. So tax avoidance is required by law, but tax evasion is illegal. But the two words I'm going to ask you to focus on for today are the words truth and accuracy, because I hear them used as if they were synonyms, and they're not. I've often seen in a Senate hearing a senator say to someone on the hot seat, "Is what you just told us accurate?" And frequently the person goes, "Yes, absolutely." But the big question should be, is what you told us true? Now, take this example. Suppose I have a piece of jewelry here, and I have an appraisal, and it says that piece of jewelry is worth $500,000. And I have another one just like it right here. And they're the sole things that I own in the world, these two things. And I say to somebody who's an accountant or a banker, I go, "What's my net worth?" And they go, "Well, let's see, $1 million. Now, let me ask you in the audience, is that accurate? Of course, it's completely accurate, because 500,000 and 500,000 equals $1 million. But the big question is it true? And lo and behold, we go online and we look up that very jewel, and we find out that thing's only worth about $50,000. What do we know now? We know that the appraisal I claimed to have was false, but the paperwork was all accurate. This should scare you. In every fraud, whether it was Enron, Madoff, Theranos, or Z-Best, every document was 100% accurate. They just weren't true. And what you need to do when you're being approached in any endeavor in business is say to yourself, the most important single factor I have to look at is the truth. And don't be fooled by accuracy. In fact, one of the red flags of fraud is that the paperwork is frequently too perfect. I remember people saying during the civil trial, which took place after I went to jail and prison, they had a civil trial, and in it, all of the people who got fooled said things like, "Well, all of the paperwork was perfect. There was always this backing up this that backed up this. We had a canceled check, and we had an invoice, and we had verifications all over the place." And then somebody on the prosecution side goes, "Well, yeah, it was all perfect. Shouldn't that have told you something? In the real world, people make mistakes. Things don't always add up. But when it's fraudulent, they're always perfect." And then they're repetitive, because once you get someone to believe something, it's very easy to repeat it. Charles Ponzi created the Ponzi scheme something like 1920. He sold the Eiffel Tower to 3 different people. And he raised millions of dollars. Well, he raised hundreds of thousands of dollars back during the Depression. Now, how does a Ponzi scheme work? Well, you think that must be outdated, but that's exactly what Bernie Madoff did. All it was a big Ponzi scheme. And currently, right now, they're investigating the company FTX, which had Bitcoins, and they're finding out that there was a misappropriation of funds. The accounting work was done like on QuickBooks. The whole thing didn't make any sense, and yet people put billions of dollars into it. And they did it because somebody believed something right at the beginning. Now, what I found at Z-Best was we just ran a giant Ponzi for a while. We would go out and get investors, and I would say to that investor, "I've got a job here. It's for $2 million. We bid it and we got the job." What people don't know is our restoration division makes about a 50% profit. Now, I've got to tell you, that should have been the biggest red flag in the history of the world, because nobody makes a 50% profit except, drug dealers. But we claimed it, and we claimed that we were, that word I said earlier, unique. There is no real industry standards. We stand alone. We're the only one doing this kind of work at this scale. And so we're able to take advantage of all sorts of things. Later, I actually broke down how we made that 50% profit. But for right now, it's important to point out that we made that claim. And I would raise $1 million from an investor to do that $2 million job. I would say in 60 days, I'm going to give you back your $1 million that you invested, and I'm going to give you half of the profits. We're going to make $1 million on this deal, and I'll give you back your million and the $500,000 in profit. Well, people were very skeptical. They go, I don't know, Mark, but okay, I'll take a risk. I'll do it one time. Invariably, when I came back 60 days later, I said, here's a cashier's check for your money and your profit. Before I could turn my back and walk out of the room, the person would say to me, well, can you do this again? And I'd say, well, yeah, we got about 10 new jobs. I'm going to go out and try to look for the money right now. Do you want a piece of the new jobs? And they'd go, yeah. They would even endorse the check back to me. And then I would go and turn the check in and get another cashier's check and go to another investor. And what we would always do, the way a Ponzi works, is you take new dollars to pay off people that put in old dollars. But what ends up happening is almost invariably, the people get greedy. They see the reality. You go, here's your real money. It's a cashier's check. Go cash it and spend it. And they think, all right, this thing actually works. After that, all the people ever see is paperwork that says, oh, look what you've made. And I had people saying, I've made $12 million investing in ZBest, and I only put up $2 million at the beginning. Isn't that incredible? But they never said, and here's my money in this account. All they had was paperwork from me as I kept creating more and more jobs. Well, that's exactly what Bernie Madoff did. He took existing dollars, raised them up, and then paid off investors with brand new dollars. So everyone was convinced that Bernie was making something like a 12% profit every single year. Now, the best hedge funds in the United States weren't making that kind of a profit, but they would say stuff like, well, we invest in 20 companies and 16 of them are making money and 4 are losing. We pick some losers sometimes too, but not Bernie Madoff. All Bernie Madoff ever did was he picked winners. Now, that should have been the biggest red flag in the world, but people get greedy. And people literally begged Bernie Madoff to take their money. He'd say, no, I have enough. I don't need any new investors. And all the while, he's taking the money. But every now and then, somebody does have to get their money back. So what you're doing is you're constantly paying money back to people in different spots, taking in more new money. But in the end, someone would say, for example, they go, well, the Madoff crime collapsed. Where is all the money? There's like an $80 billion fraud. Where's the money? As if there's some big vault somewhere with the money in it. In reality, because you're constantly paying it out in different places and then taking in new dollars to be able to do that, because there's no reality to what you're doing, you're not really investing in anything, that at some point, too many people needed their money back. And so his entire $80 billion fraud collapsed because people wanted $7 billion in total, and he couldn't come up with it. And the whole thing falls apart. And everybody goes, how could this possibly happen? You convince somebody the first time that what you're doing is real, and after that, they just believe it and keep putting money into it. And that's what we did at ZBest. Now, somebody might say, well, how do you get out of that? At some point, pyramid schemes have to fall apart. Well, what you do is you say to them, you have to look for an exit strategy. Now, I served 4 years in a federal prison. Well, actually, it was a federal prison camp. A lot of people call it Club Fed, but that's not really fair. I did witness a couple murders and quite a few assaults and attacks, so it really wasn't what people think. In fact, there was almost 1,000 inmates there, and only 40 of us were in for white-collar crimes. But be that as it may, I did serve that time, and I talked to different people, and I would say, what is your exit strategy? How are you going to get out of this? And invariably, they would say to me, Mark, I didn't have one. I just wanted it to keep going as long as it could, and maybe I'd jump on a plane and go to some place that doesn't have extradition, because they really didn't have a plan. Now, at ZBest, we were actually very fortunate. We had a plan. One of the leading investment banks that told us, we can provide you guys with hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars to buy real companies. And I thought, this is what we get. Let's get them to give us enough money to put out our fires and pay off everybody. And then let's take those new companies that are all legitimate and let's run them and make real dollars. I thought, this is great. We have an exit strategy. And I even thought up a new lie to explain why we were suddenly going to stop doing the restoration jobs. And that was quite a feat. How do you tell somebody I'm making 50% profit and suddenly I'm going to stop doing it? Why would you do that? Well, you had to have a story, and I'm going to tell you that story. But getting back to those things about words, as I talk today, try to say to yourself, is what he's describing something that looks easy to verify and therefore is accurate, or could it possibly be that it's really true? Now, I'll give you a great example of that. At ZBest, we made a claim, and I can remember talking to the people that did due diligence. Those are the lawyers, accountants, and bankers that had to believe our story. We had a CEO who was very flamboyant, very powerful speaker. He'd go on TV and people just thought our company is one of the greatest there is. And behind the scenes, you had to have a bit of a puppeteer. That's the role I fulfilled. And I made tens of thousands of documents to convince the due diligence people that the stuff that they were hearing was real. And that paperwork sometimes is way more important than even the show. You've got to have those numbers. They've got to add up and they've got to be perfect. Now, at one point, finally, somebody said, how do you make that profit? And I said, this is a secret. So I want this kept in this room, but here's what we did. We found out that Korean companies and Chinese companies were making carpet much cheaper and just as good as our carpet, but much less expensive. And one by one, all of the great carpet mills in the southeastern United States are going bankrupt. Well, Barry Minko, the head of the company ZBest, and myself, we went in and bought millions of dollars worth of inventory from these carpet companies before they went bankrupt. And we got that stuff at 5 and 10 cents on the dollar. They were lucky to get rid of it. They just wanted to dump it onto the marketplace and get at least whatever money they could get back, because they couldn't compete with the deadly Pacific Rim. I said, we actually got that carpet for 10 cents on the dollar, but when we bill it on our invoices, we put down the market rate. So I said, all of our profit comes from the fact that we're not that great of a restoration company. We're a great carpet buying company. We bought the carpet, and if you look at our invoices, the biggest single thing on every invoice is millions of dollars worth of carpet. Well, the people who heard that story said, Mark, that's ingenious. That was brilliant of you. How did you guys ever think of that? I go, well, we just sort of stumbled into it and it worked like a charm. But guess what? We're running out of carpet. So in the next month or two, we're going to stop doing restorations altogether. They're just going to disappear. But by that time, we'll have made enough money and got enough money from Wall Street to buy these legitimate companies that Drexel Burnham wanted us to buy, and we'd run them, and eventually we'd make out and be great. And everyone bought it. They thought that was a great story. And they bought it because it seemed to be very accurate. Now let's look at that story and let's see if we can find out what's wrong with it. If you're selling a product and you need to charge $1 for it, and the Chinese and the Koreans are selling that same product for 80 cents, you're going to go broke. You can't compete with them. You file for a bankruptcy and you sell your assets for whatever you can get for them. But what would you sell those assets for? Would you sell it for 10 cents on the dollar? Why? All you have to do is undercut what the Koreans or the Chinese are doing. If they're selling it for 80 cents, you lower your price to 79 cents. And even though you're losing the money, you're going to lose it anyway. You're going to go bankrupt anyway. At least you got rid of the carpet. Why would you sell it for 10 cents on the dollar? You wouldn't. It makes no sense. And anybody who's been through a bankruptcy should have said to me, Mark, your story doesn't make any sense. They wouldn't sell that stuff at 10 cents on the dollar. They'd sell it at 79 cents to the dollar, undercutting their competition, and they're going to go broke anyway. But so the entire foothold of my story couldn't stand up. But in order to see that, you had to take a step back and say, what is it I'm being asked to believe? And if I repeat that quite a few times today, it's going to be very important, because the first thing you have to do when you're looking into something, whether you're investing in it, whether it's an invoice, whether it's a balance sheet, whether it's something that somebody wants you to become a part of, whatever it is, when you're doing your due diligence and looking into it, always stop and ask yourself, what am I being asked to believe? Now, I have a good example of how this works. When you look at any great investment or anything that you're thinking about doing, you say to yourself, what is it that they're actually asking me to believe? Now, say you had a company called Pfizer, and you've developed pharmaceuticals. And in the industry, everybody is making, I'll just pull a number, everybody's making 12% profit. But you're making like 25, almost 30% profit. Well, the first question you have to ask is, how do you do that? How is it that every other company is struggling along with 12% and you're making over twice that? What's the answer? Well, somebody at Pfizer says, we've invented this new pill. It's called Viagra. I've heard it's a little blue pill, although I've never seen one, but I've heard about them. And they said, we thought it would mainly be bought by elderly men, but it turns out that everyone from 16 to 60 to 80 wants to buy this product. And for 20 years, we've got the stranglehold on it. We've got the patent. Nobody else can reverse engineer this and make it. We're the only company that can. And we can make it for 15 cents and charge $10 per pill, and the marketplace will do it. And so for a few years, we're going to make some huge profits. Now, that analysis isn't perfect. I don't claim to know the inner workings of Pfizer or anybody else, but that's where you have an example of a story. You're being asked to believe you make this huge profit, and here's how you make it. And then you go to the competitors, and you say to somebody at AstraZeneca, you know, I was told this by Pfizer. Is that believable? And they go, yeah, it's totally believable. We wish we had invented that pill. And you say to yourself, okay, now I've done this transaction. I'm now convinced that this thing is real, that it's not fake. But notice you had to do a series of steps. Now, I'm going to try to teach you those series of steps. I call them tier 1 through tier 4. And isn't that clever? I came up with that all by myself. A tier 1 question that you have to ask about anything that you're doing due diligence on. A tier 1 question, a question of what am I being asked to believe, is what we call a journalism question. A good journalism story has who, what, when, where, why, and how in the first paragraph. You read that first paragraph and you have to know all of those things. So you start out with that kind of a question. You say, how do you make all of this profit, Z-Best? And then I give you an answer. Tier 2 is where you go and say, I've got to go to the best authoritative body I can find and find out if what I was just told by Mark is close to the industry. It makes some kind of sense. So you go to tier 2 and you ask a competitor, for example, you do construction work and you do some reconstruction work like ServiceMaster and companies like that. Can you tell me a bit about it? Because this company Z-Best is making a 50% profit. Well, immediately the person being asked that is going to say, that's impossible. No one could make that kind of profit. Labor's a fixed cost. You've got unions you have to go through, materials. Everybody knows what the cost of materials are. There's no way they could be making this kind of a profit. So tier 3 is you go back to me, the guy who told the original lie, and you say, I've talked to all of your competitors and they say X, Y, and Z is the way it really works. You've got to explain to me and convince me that there's something unique about you that isn't X, Y, or Z. And that's when I told that ridiculous follow-up story, which then falls apart on tier 3, because on tier 3, you've gone back to the authoritative body and said to whoever it might be, sometimes it's the government, sometimes it's an association, sometimes it's just a competitor, and you've said, well, they claim to have bought this carpet at 10 cents on the dollar, and everybody else goes, if we could do that, we'd all do it. But why would somebody sell it to you at 10 cents on the dollar? None of this makes any business sense. What you're being told is a lie. And so now at tier 4, you go back to confront me and you go, Mark, right now I'm going to call the Justice Department because you're lying to me and there's no way you can make it hold together. And I'd have been stuck there going, here, go ahead and cuff me, busted. But no one ever bothered to do that. No one ever bothered to go tiers 1 through tier 4. Now, why is it important to you? Would you like to be one of those 83 people waiting for the Justice Department to knock on your door and arrest you? Or would you like to be able to say to those people, I'm innocent of everything, and I can show you how I'm innocent? Well, that's actually happened. Over the years, I've gotten 1,300 emails or letters from people who said to me, Mark, I used your tier 1 through 4 analysis, asked a bunch of questions, and I discovered some fraud. 1,300 of them. I've talked to FBI agents when I actually taught at the FBI Academy. I'm one of the few people who's a former criminal that actually got paid to talk to the FBI Academy. And I remember talking to them very well, and it was a tough audience. Believe me, when you're a criminal and you're talking to the FBI, that's a tough crowd. But what was interesting to me was instead of fighting it, instead of attacking me like they certainly could have, they really wanted to learn something. And when I drew the differentiation between truth and accuracy and the steps of tier 1 through 4, and then I ended up by saying the following. Whenever you're looking at something and you want to do a tier 1 through tier 4 analysis of it, document it, write it in a journal, go home to your computer, send yourself an email. That way you'll have a date and a time where you can say to somebody at a later time, we suspected you of something, prove to me you're innocent. Now, I know in America, you're supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And I hate to tell you guys that, but that's not the way it really works. The simple truth is, every juror looks at the defendant at the table and says, that's the guilty guy. And it pretty much falls to you to establish your innocence. But when a white-collar crime happens, no one exactly knows how deep it goes. In our case, it was really just the CEO of the company and me, the CFO, or I had liked the position of CFO. In other companies, like in Enron, 31 people ended up being indicted. And they looked at, as I said before, 114 people. So you have to sit there and say to yourself, well, how do I make sure if at worst, if I'm a person they're looking at, how do I prove my innocence, even though I shouldn't have to? Well, one of the ways you can do it is you can say, look, I can show you this. Here's the kind of person I am. Every single week, I do some extra due diligence on some document that crossed my desk, or some story I was told on the telephone, or something that I've picked up that I read somewhere. I do some extra due diligence, and then I document it. So now I can show you a journal of 100 times that I went the extra mile, that I went and looked really hard, and I asked those tier 1 through tier 4 questions, and the answers all came back good. Notice that tier 1 through tier 4 doesn't guarantee you're going to find fraud, because some fraudsters do a really good job, and they build firewalls, and you can't break through them. But in most cases, there's going to be a weakness in there, and you'll either have found it, or you can say, at least I looked for it. And looking for it might be the very thing that helps you, because I talked to an FBI agent who said to me, Mark, we had some people we were thinking of indicting, and they had just such a journal, and I asked those people, where'd you get the idea to do that? And they said, we took a class from this guy, Mark. And I'm feeling pretty good. I'm going, hey, there's some people that might have wrongly be put in jail, and they weren't, because they did what I asked them to do. And that is to analyze the truth and analyze the accuracy. Now, in the case of ZBest, as I said, we had a bit of an exit strategy. Now at Enron, they had a bigger problem. They had to constantly grow. But Enron was able to use existing laws and turn them on their head in order to defraud people. They used existing laws, and they tried to follow them to the letter of the law. And what they did was, when they needed to create revenue out of thin air, they were able to do the following. I'm going to simplify this, but try to imagine, if you will, here is Enron. And the government has invented a thing called special purpose entities, SPEs. Now, the special purpose entity is an off-the-books partnership that companies that are full of cash are going to invest in, but they're risky. They could lose significant money. And we don't want to make our home company look bad. So what the government said was, if you follow the following rules, you can do the following thing. You can create an LLC or a partnership, and you can put 97% of the money or assets into that. An outsider or group of outsiders has to put in the 3%, and that 3% holder has to run the partnership, be in charge. And as long as you do that, you do not have to carry the losses that are incurred in this startup forward to your consolidated balance sheet. And that's to encourage companies to take risk and to invest and to try some things that maybe aren't going to work out. And you don't want to look bad. So they created this law for special purpose entities. But somebody at Enron realized they could use those special purpose entities to actually manufacture income. Now imagine you're being told at Enron, in 10 days, your earnings statement is going to come out from the accountant. And you're going to be short, and I'll just pick a number, $100 million of what we expected. And when that happens, your stock's going to take a bit of a hit. It's going to go down. And you've got 10 days to find some way to make $100 million. How do you do it? You create a special purpose entity. You then take an asset that you control, and using a method called mark-to-market accounting, which you don't have to understand, you're able to give that evaluation. And you put that asset into the special purpose entity. And let's say you claim that asset's worth $100 million. And you can do that because you are the marketplace. So you can use mark-to-market accounting. You've got $100 million sitting over here in this SPE. Now you form another SPE over here. And you borrow money or get investor money and you put $200 million into that SPE. Then that SPE buys the $100 million asset, but they pay $200 million for it. Why? Because they're stupid. It doesn't matter why. They buy that asset, and now it's over here. Now this special purpose entity owes hundreds of millions of dollars. This one now has $200 million. It made $100 million profit. So what do they do with that profit? Since the law says you don't have to carry forward the profits or losses, don't have to means you can if you want to. So Enron carries that gain forward to their consolidated balance sheet, and magically, with 10 days to go, they made another $100 million profit. Now they're still going to owe $200 or $300 million over here, but that's off the books. Nobody knows about that. And they're so creditworthy, they can borrow any amount of money they need to create these SPEs. They created hundreds and hundreds of special purpose entities, all of which were sending assets back and forth, creating revenues, ergo profits, out of thin air. Mark-to-market accounting with a federal law that was designed for one purpose and then used for a totally different purpose. Now, how do people do that? Because, I hate to say it, but the people who write the bills in Congress don't have a devious enough mind, and the fraudsters do. So the fraudster looks at something and says, hey, I can take advantage of this. Now, how could that work? Let me give you a good example. During the Obama administration, the Congress passed a thing called the Jobs Bill. And if you'll notice, whenever they pass a bill, it sounds really great, like the Clean Water Act. Who's opposed to that? Clean Air Act. Nobody's opposed to that. So we have a bill here called the Jobs Bill. What's it supposed to do, Mark? It's going to create jobs. That sounds pretty good to me. How does it work? Well, they said we can now use this magic tool that's come to our attention called the internet. You can form a corporation, advertise it on the internet, and you can try to raise money for that deal. Now, the people who invest in it can only be small people, but they have to be what's called an accredited investor. But they don't have to show you any proof that they're an accredited investor. You just have to ask them, oh, by the way, are you accredited? And they go, yeah. They can only put up to $10,000 into it, and they can't put in more than 10% of their own income. So it's to get people to put money into startups. And as long as you do that, as long as it's no more than $10,000, not more than 10% of your income, and you claim to be an accredited investor, you can invest in this corporation that I formed. I can raise up to $1 million. So I raised the $1 million because I have a pretty slick ad on the internet. And what I'm supposed to do with that $1 million is hire people, which is why they called it the Jobs Bill. Now,
I look at that and go, hey, that could actually work. That sounds pretty good. I employ a bunch of people. And then a devious part of my brain that I try not to use anymore thought of the following. What's to stop me from creating 50 of these corporations, having a slick internet ad for each one of them, raising the maximum I can possibly raise, get $1 million in each one of them, and then pay myself to be the CEO of all of them, and pay myself $48 million. And one by one, all of those partnerships go bankrupt. Have I followed the law to the letter? Well, yeah, nobody invested more than $10,000. Nobody put in more than 10% of their income. They all claim to be accredited investors. I'm not bound to say that the deal's going to be successful and make money. I'm not even bound to hire people. That was just the purpose of the bill. So we look at the jobs bill and we say to ourselves, wait a minute, this is crazy. This very rule that was designed with the best of intentions, the best way to let little investors kind of reap some of the benefits that just the big guys get to do. And yet it can be turned so that people could say, I can actually follow the letter of the law to break the law, to get something fraudulently. Enron did it with special purpose entities by reading the law and twisting it to their will. The jobs bill does the exact same thing. If somebody wanted to, they could raise millions of dollars on the jobs bill and follow to the letter of the law and then pay themselves an outrageous salary, or even pay themselves a huge salary. And who knows, maybe some of those businesses will work. But the simple truth is, they're probably not going to. So the jobs bill, instead of creating jobs, gave an avenue for devious people to rip people off. Now, look at some of these other frauds. How do those things progress? Let's look at what Madoff did. I got a phone call from Bittner Federal Prison, and guess who it was? It was Bernie Madoff. He called me, and he said to me, I read a lot about the Z-Best case. And he said, I hope you don't mind, but I used quite a few of the tricks you had in the story. I used those very same tricks on the people in my Ponzi scheme. Now, I wasn't flattered, to say the least, but I looked at it and thought to myself, my God, this is kind of incredible. Literally, I found out that people were begging to invest in his hedge fund because it never lost. However, a man by the name of Markopoulos investigated Bernie Madoff, I think like 10 years before Madoff was caught. And he went to the SEC and he said, what Bernie Madoff is doing is mathematically impossible. And yet it took years for that thing to implode. But I think the main reason was no one was asking the right questions. They were being told, well, you're supposed to believe that Bernie Madoff somehow magically is better than all other hedge funds. Bernie never picks a loser. Bernie only makes money. Now, if you think about it, you go, anybody who never takes a loss isn't taking enough risk, in my opinion. But no one bothered with that because they were so happy with the money they thought they were making on paper. And I look at it this way, there's a spectrum of evil. I'm on that spectrum. I broke the law. I did some pretty terrible things. I've had friends say to me, Mark, can you tell me in a short way what your crime was? I said, I can do that in a couple words. I was a big liar. I told big lies, little lies. I told lies by collusion. I told lies everywhere. And keeping track of all those lies was so difficult to do. So when I became a speaker and I was talking to people about the very topic of fraud, I made up my mind to do one thing and one thing for sure. And that was tell all of you the truth. Everything I'm telling you today is true. It really happened. Now, I wouldn't blame any of you out there for going, well, Mark, you just got through telling me you're the biggest liar in the history of the world, and now you're saying we're supposed to believe you. So I'm not going to go that far, but I will say this. If you pretend to believe me and follow the directions I give, that's good enough for me. Ask the right questions, ignore the accuracy for a while, and say to yourself, what's the truth? What is really going on here? And that way you won't fall into the trap of asking questions like, where's all the money, with Bernie Madoff? Or the trap that was founded by Theranos. Now try to imagine this. Theranos is a company that says with one drop of blood, we can do 285 or 65 diagnostic tests and tell you what's happening. And everybody goes, that's fantastic. I can't wait to avail myself of this wonderful technology. But what is it that happened? They weren't doing it. They hadn't built the better mousetrap. The whole thing was fake. But look what they did to make it look real. They got David Boies to be their lawyer. For those of you who don't remember David Boies, he was the big lawyer in the case where Al Gore and George Bush were arguing in Florida as to who really won the election. He was their key lawyer. Well, who's going to question David Boies? Who's on the board of directors? George Shultz, the former, the Secretary of State? All these big politicians, admirals, generals, all these big, powerful names are all on the board of directors. It's got to be real, right? We're being asked to believe that with one drop of blood, they can do 265 tests, but every other company has to draw a whole bunch of blood and do individual tests. When I go in and they test me for like 5 or 6 things, like my liver and kidney and whatever other organs I might have, they draw a whole vial of blood for each one of those tests. Because as you do those tests, you ruin the blood sample sometimes. You have to add dye to it, or you have to do different things to it, heat it, cool it, do stuff that'll tell you whether or not a person is suffering from a malady. So every virologist in the United States said, this is impossible. Theranos has to be a fake. It can't possibly be real. But look, it took a decade for that to come crashing down and for Elizabeth Holmes to be in jail. Now, I actually talked to Elizabeth Holmes on the phone. So I not only talked to Bernie Madoff, but I talked to Elizabeth Holmes. I was raising money for a company that was developing its own diagnostic test. And I had somebody that was interested in putting millions of dollars into it, but they changed their mind and decided to invest in Theranos. So I investigated Theranos. I don't know anything about virology. I don't know anything about blood work. But I asked a whole bunch of experts, and they all said to me, Mark, we're really suspicious. And we think people's lives are putting at risk because they're believing the findings of those tests. And even the people who worked for Theranos had questions that they were asking when they thought they were simply doing verification tests to make sure that their test was really working properly. They were actually doing the real test. And so Theranos came crumbling down, Madoff came crumbling down, Enron came crumbling down, and ZBest came crumbling down. All of them took something with them. They took people's trust and people's money. And on that spectrum of evil that I'm on, I think Bernie Madoff is at the head of that spectrum. He took money from charities. He took money from hardworking people. He took their last dollar. We're pretty terrible at ZBest, but I was able to say at least that we got most of our money from Wall Street, but that's not a very good thing. You know, it's been said that a brave man only dies once, but a coward dies 1,000 deaths. That same analysis is true with trust. If you think back into your mind, what was the greatest hurt you ever had? I bet it wasn't money. I bet the greatest hurt you ever had is when somebody you trusted violated that trust. And no matter how long you stay friends or what you do together, in the back of your mind, you're always thinking about that person took your trust and misused it. Well, that's what we did at ZBest. I took people's trust and I used it. And I've decided the day I walked out of that federal prison that I was going to do everything that I could to try to make some sort of amends for it. So my first thought was, I want all of you listening to me to indemnify yourself. Analyze something you're looking at with tier 1 through tier 4 analysis. And when you find something that's too good to be true, it probably isn't true. Ask yourself what you're being asked to believe, and realize that if Enron, Bernie Madoff, Theranos, and ZBest could get people to put up hundreds, billions of dollars, all based on total fabrication, that maybe it could happen to you. The only thing that's going to protect you is if you do the due diligence yourself. Now, of course, you have to rely on accountants and lawyers and bankers and a bunch of other people, but you've got to ask the questions and never be afraid of what the answer might be. Never be afraid that the answer might be, you shouldn't do this. These profits are too good. Always be suspicious of anyone who says, I've got something that's totally unique. Theranos claimed it, Enron claimed it, Madoff claimed it, and we at ZBest claimed it. None of us really had anything that was unique. We just told a different story. We just used our puppeteer hands to create an illusion. I created over 30,000 documents. And when people say to me, and I've often heard this, they go, Mark, who did you expect to fool with this shoddy work? I go ask Wall Street. They were ready to give us billions of dollars. The simple fact is that I've never taken an accounting class in my life. And we and Barry Minka were able to sell the bill of goods. I created the paperwork and Barry told the story. He was the CEO and I was like the CFO. That paperwork is what got us all that money. And I can tell you something right now. I've had people say to me as I opened this talk, you know, Mark, you committed your crime decades ago, but things have changed. I got bad news for you. Nothing changes. I read a quote one time and it said something along the lines of, teenagers today are terrible. They don't respect their parents. They think they invented sex and they're just bad. And then I looked up to who made that quote. It was Plato and Aristotle talking to each other in ancient Greece. No matter how much we think things have changed, they haven't. Right now, somebody's pulling off a Ponzi scheme. Somebody's lying to someplace, and billions of dollars are going into companies like FTX and other entities. And then when these things get caught, look at the damage that happens to the people. But one of the biggest damages is if you're one of those 83 people that was waiting for that knock on the door, that government agency coming to you and saying, we're going to indict you now. And you're thinking, I'm innocent. I might have been stupid. I might not have done my job as good as I should have, but I didn't break the law. And now I've got to prove myself. Well, you can avoid all of that by doing the steps I said. Do a tier 1 through 4 analysis. And when you do it, document it. Simply type in your computer, today I looked at a balance sheet and I made a couple phone calls and found out that the suppliers are all real. When I was at ZBest, if anybody had done that, we'd have been caught in 5 minutes because all of my vendors were rented post office boxes. Nobody ever bothered to ask. Nobody ever bothered to look under that rock. Nobody ever bothered to protect themselves. Only you can do that. Do what I said. Be skeptical, tier 1 through 4. Ask what I'm being asked to believe, and then see if it's true, not accurate.